Good evening. My name is Mike Haney, and welcome to another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America. We have a very exciting show for you today. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Yeah, good evening again. My name is Mike Haney, and today we have a very exciting show for you today as we talk politics, particularly Maryland politics and the gubernatorial election, which we have two candidates, one, Wes Moore, the Democratic candidate, and today we're interviewing Dan Cox, the Republican nominee for governor here in the state of Maryland. Mr. Cox is currently finishing up a speaking engagement in a part of Maryland and will be with us as soon as he finishes up. But, we felt as though on 60 Minutes in Black America, just as we did during the primary season when Mr. Cox appeared, and Mr. Cox Mr. Cox was our most popular podcast to date as a result of his appearance, which was surprising to many of us. And we'd like to think that our viewership specifically, felt as though it was necessary to understand specifically what Mr. Cox had to say for themselves, which is why we have Mr. Cox on this show. As a host of a show, my opinion is irrelevant to presenting you, the viewers, the perspective of both candidates. And we are working with Mr. Moore's campaign, as Mr. Moore will be scheduled as well on 60 Minutes in Black America as now the Democratic candidate coming out of the primary as well. So you'll get a chance to hear both perspectives. You'll hear this evening Mr. Cox's perspective, his platform, some of what he thinks about national issues that, governors weigh in considerably. When you look at Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida and what he did relative to immigration policies of Florida that affected this country. When you think about environmental issues, governors' opinions in this country weigh very heavily. And it'll be very intriguing to hear Mr. Cox's opinion on things such as immigration reforms, things such as election reform, the inflation and the economy, as how he would govern the state of Maryland for all people. And Maryland is one of the states in this country that from a demographic perspective is very mixed. In most instances, Maryland has voted mainly Democratic, with the exception of the most recent two gubernatorial election in which a Republican, Larry Hogan, won those two elections. Now, Governor Hogan, has come out against Mr. Cox, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the relationship between Mr. Cox or Delegate Cox and the current Republican governor in terms of why there are issues of governing between them and what their differences are. Larry Hogan happens to be the most popular governor ever from a polling perspective, as long as polling has been done on candidates. He polls somewhere around 70% of the people of the state of Maryland eligible to vote supporting him. And Mr. Hogan said after Mr. Cox, surprisingly to many, here on 60 Minutes in Black America, we actually called Dan Cox the winner of the Republican primary between a Hogan-endorsed candidate, Kelly Schultz, and the Delegate Cox. We called Cox the winner. On election night, we again called Cox the winner because we heard that the sentiment for someone that supported Donald Trump was high in Maryland. And is this the path to victory for Dan Cox? Because we want to understand the recent polls came out in Maryland where Dan Cox is polling 22% behind Wes Moore currently. He's 22% behind. The same that the current governor was behind when he was running against the former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Anthony Brown. So they're probably at about the same places, but with one exception. You have two Republicans that are not in agreement and accord to what it is that they see as how you govern the state of Maryland. So, how does Mr. Cox govern? How does he overcome this 22% lead? What is his strategy going forward to convince the voters in Maryland, and particularly you, particularly the demographics that normally view this channel, although I suspect that we have a wider reach and a wider audience, just as we did when he was on this show before, that are interested in his perspective. You know, his interest is interesting in terms of how he talks about the Second Amendment in terms of the right to bear arms. And he says that the right to bear arms is more, it affects the community of African Americans more than any other community because it denies them the rights in certain instances, particularly in a city like Baltimore that has high crime rates, from being able to carry and conceal weapons to protect themselves. So it'll be interesting to hear how he explains that to you today. It'll be interesting to hear how he intends to deal with inflation in Maryland. It'll be interesting to see how he and the other candidate, the Democratic candidate, Wes Moore, both agree that education is crucial in the state of Maryland and at the top of both of their agenda. However, with this difference that Dan Cox implies from an educational perspective, he talks about parental rights. You know, he talks about gender equality. You know, he talks about CRT or critical race theory being taught in schools. And what does that mean? What does that mean relative to his agenda to educate Marylanders, particularly in communities such as Prince George's County, one of the richest Black counties in the United States, Baltimore City, one of the more populous urban environments in the country of African Americans, where we comprise over 60% of the population. So when you talk specificity relative to education, but you're talking critical race theory, you're talking whether girls and boys should use gender neutral restrooms, or whether girls can play on boys' teams and boys can play on girls' teams, versus quantifiable educational opportunities to move the needle for particularly Blacks in the two counties where continually in Prince George's County and Baltimore City are at the bottom of a 24 county state. So Baltimore City is usually last, and Prince George's County is usually next to last. And so how does Delegate Cox intend to move the needle on reading, writing, arithmetic, those things that are important, versus the parental rights of deciding whether kids should go to school masked or whether kids should have vaccination, particularly out of the recent pandemic, versus being able to educate kids to move them forward, where the other candidate seems to imply that there's a need to ensure that kids are educated. So you have two different theories of education, but both say that education are important. And you, the viewers, have an opportunity tonight to view Dan Cox, which is important, and judge him for that. You know, Dan Cox, even though he is self-described as a Trump-endorsed candidate, right? And he is a non-believer that President Biden won the election. And we're going to ask him to quantify that tonight. We're going to ask him to quantify that with factual data, et cetera, so that we understand exactly how he got to that conclusion. You know, we're going to understand how he feels working with President Trump is of value in this state. And it could be because you saw the benefit and value of him as a Trump endorsed candidate to a more mainstream and traditional Republican candidate in the primary, him beat her handily. And so is this where we see the opportunity, and this is where he sees the opportunity as a path forward for him to perhaps win the election in November by what we call the closet factor. Those that may not necessarily feel comfortable coming out saying that they support and they agree with how Trump managed and run. Maybe they have some issues with his behavior, as we heard in the newsroom and the streets, but that from a political platform, they felt that his political platform was more beneficial to the economy, dealt with the immigration policies more efficiently than the Democratic Party did. And so they didn't want the discomfort of going against friends that may look like me or may look like you by saying, hey, love Trump, support Trump. They may not say anything, but when it comes to November, are these the ones that are actually going to go to the polls, cross over, and vote for a candidate like Delegate Cox? And, you know, we can't discount that. And so it'll be interesting to hear Delegate Cox's perspective on how he gets to the State House in Maryland. What I'd like to do, if you had an opportunity to go to our YouTube channel, and I urge those of you that are watching us on YouTube to please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have some compelling interviews, Westmore, compelling interviews with Dan Cox before they got to this point, two potentially neophyte politicians, because Dan Cox was only in the legislature.
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Hey.
Just heard from Dan Cox and his campaign. Mr. Cox is ready. He's here, ready to go live on our show right now. Just wanted to give you a message about that.
Wow. Hey, that's breaking news in itself. Thank you very much, Leon. And Leon's our producer. And before we bring Delegate Cox in, let me give our production team, because what you're seeing is a professional production. And I think that's one of the reasons why Mr. Cox camp, because of how professional this production team produced this podcast for you. Jay, Leon, Jeremiah, Jasmine, Orrin, all the ones behind the scene to make this happen, doing the research for the information that you're hearing me talk about, and ensuring that Mr. Cox is well heard, because nowhere else, Mr. Cox, I've seen Mr. Cox, and I got to tell you, Mr. Cox to me is a nice guy. You know, our first interview was absolutely just nice. Besides him telling me at one point that something wasn't my business, and guess what? He was right. You know, he was just a very cordial guy, and his reputation, from what I found, was stellar, you know, from what we usually judge value and reputation. But our production team is able to bring this together so that you get an understanding and a perspective of every candidate. In addition to that, you're not getting a soundbite. You know, you're not getting someone that interrupts a candidate after 12 minutes. I saw him on Steve Bannon. I saw Mr. Cox on Steve Bannon. Everyone knows who Steve Bannon is. He got 12 minutes. Fox News DC, he got 14 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes. You get a whole hour of hearing him thoroughly so that you're able to judge, as we should do. You should be able to judge fairly what this candidate has to say thoroughly as he wants to present his issues. So before we bring Mr. Cox in, I want to play this clip as Mr. Cox talks about himself and his campaign. Production team, could you play this clip from Mr. Cox before we bring Mr. Cox in?
Freedom is what makes Maryland great. But for the last 2 years, we have experienced unprecedented assaults on those freedoms in the form of heavy-handed mandates and lawless violence in the streets. As a state delegate here in Annapolis, I fought efforts to defund the police in my committee, and I won. Importantly, I fought HB 650, a bill which would have granted emergency powers to the governor to indefinitely seize private property without remuneration. And I won. I fought for small businesses by sponsoring legislation for tax relief, and I won. I will end Maryland school programs which teach our children to hate their country and each other. As governor, I will defend the Maryland and federal constitutions. I will be your voice. I'm State Delegate Dan Cox, and I'm running for governor to restore power back to the people.
Dan Cox has my complete and total endorsement.
Powerful, powerful video. And now let's bring the man of the hour, Delegate Dan Cox, the gubernatorial candidate for the Republican Party for the state of Maryland. Delegate Cox, good to see you again. Thank you so much. I know you've got a hectic schedule.
Thank you so much. It's an honor, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm literally at an event with the sheriffs, and had been about 7 hours on the road today, all the way from First Baptist of Glenarden and in Prince George's up here, all the way out in the beautiful Allegheny. And so thank you for your patience with me and coming on today. It's a great honor.
Hey, well, listen, I appreciate you making sure that you came back on our show. You made that commitment when you were on before. And as we talked about then, it's important that all communities hear you for themselves. You know, what my thinking is irrelevant for you and your competitor in this governor's race, but being a platform that you can talk to the issues and talk to who you are is what's relevant. And it looks like the viewership is extremely high today. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk. How's your family? You know, Delegate Cox, when we interviewed first, we talked a bit about your family, but I know our time is a little bit more closed today, but you've got 10 kids and your wonderful wife. How's everyone doing?
Oh, thank you. They're doing wonderfully. You know, I wanted to make it clear to the kids. My wife and I said, look, you know, this campaign is not going to leave you with a bitter taste. We're going to make sure that we enjoy this time. And so if we go on a parade together, we get ice cream and pizza. If we, if we're out there working late, sometimes, obviously working late, we try to take a moment to pause the next morning over breakfast before I head back out the door. So, and obviously, my wife is a key part of making that happen for them. And it's been a good process because that's why we're running. We're here for families to rebuild Maryland and make sure that we can, raise our kids here, to make sure that we have opportunities for them here, that our children can go to school here, make sure that they access the job, the jobs that they would need to stay here and to be able to live. And we see a growing difficulty with that in Maryland. And so I'm excited to be running to work on those issues to make it much more of a place where we can be able to sustain our families here.
You know, Delegate Cox, you're taking us and segueing us right into what I want to talk with you about, because one of the things that I've noticed from the primary election, where we called you the winner in the primary, we called you the winner in the primary after you left here, and then election night we called you the winner. We knew you won decisively, right? Is that since then I saw your signs in areas of Baltimore where no one may have expected it, East Baltimore, whatever. I saw you interacting with people and demographics from all across our state. And there was always a curiosity factor that if a Trump-endorsed candidate won this primary, just how would he govern the totality of the demographics of a state like Maryland? So I want to talk about education first, because that's a piece of it. We talked about, before you came on, the fact that the two highest demographics of Blacks in our state, Prince George's County and Baltimore City, are at the very bottom educationally of this state, right? You and Mr. Moore said that education is at the top of your agenda for change in the state of Maryland. Could you tell us specifically what your plans are that would affect the ability to educate our young people, in particularly those two demographics, but of course all around the state?
Well, first and foremost, we need to make sure that the funding is equalized. I don't think that should be something we should disagree on. That's a bipartisan approach. But when you have funding to the classrooms, and that's what I want to make sure happens, You can't be indoctrinating the children with this transgender ideology pre-K on up. And that's exactly what, unfortunately, sets us apart as candidates. I will ban that and work hard to make sure that our kids have a world-class education that will allow them to access the jobs that will make them the wealth they need and have the opportunities that they need to stay here in Maryland. And we'll work hard to give them, opportunities to do certifications with tech schools and those kinds of, not every kid necessarily is interested or planning to go to college. And yet to get good jobs, we need to have good training. And, one of the things that I've seen in our state that is working is programs like Allegheny College of Maryland has a high school program where you can graduate high school with a certification in a tech field, whether it's mechanical, whether it's electronics, whether it's computers. And that can then, as an 18-year-old high school graduate with a certification, you can then qualify for a $35 to $45 an hour job right out of high school. That's the kind of wage that lifts our society up. That's the kind of opportunity and training that makes it happen for our Marylanders. And unfortunately, in Prince George's and Baltimore City and all across our state, my county included, Frederick County, these options, these training programs and the money to the classroom is not happening for education that makes them a world-class citizen. Instead, we have a real clear gender politics that has no place in the classroom, and we have specifically a program that says that children, girls will have to compete with boys in sports, and so they're cut out of college scholarships sometimes. This is a problem, and it's a serious problem. I've had some people tell me, Leon, that on the campaign trail, that is it really that big of a problem? And my answer to that is, look at the curriculum right now. And how is that going to impact our children moving forward? And particularly, how is it going to impact ensuring that our family structures are supported? Because if you're undermining parents in the classroom, then you're going to undermine the family. And that will disintegrate going forward, having the best education and the best structures that we can have for all of our kids, because the science shows that parents involved in their children's education makes that child a far more successful likelihood as they progress. And, one of the problems and things that differentiates me from my opponent is the fact that we have different philosophies on how to make this happen for the classroom. His approach is a centralized approach from, utilizing the Kerwin framework from a Baltimore and Annapolis, a centralized Maryland State Department of Education approach. And Westmore promises to use the gender indoctrination across Maryland through the local schools, forcing local boards of education to adopt these policies. Now, I have the exact opposite approach. I'm not a centralized education-focused person. I want to decentralize the power structure and put power back to the people so that your local school boards will have these decisions with parents in mind right at the table. And one of the ways we can improve that immediately in Baltimore City, for instance, where we are failing our children in Baltimore City. Article 8 of the Constitution guarantees them an education that's world-class, and we're not giving it. 7% have a good passage rate on some of these tests. That's a failure on our part. Here's what we can do immediately. We can change the Board of Education in Baltimore City to have elected representatives with much more parental involvement. And that's what I intend to do statewide, and encouraging that power back to the people model.
Is that what you hear out there on the campaign trail, particularly regarding parental rights and let's say gender neutral restaurants, for instance, where some people say it's confusing? What are you hearing people, particularly in Baltimore City and other jurisdictions, say to you about your plan to ban that? Are they giving you feedback in Baltimore City and Prince George's County so that you're hearing that across all demographics?
Yes. The short answer is people just want their kids to get, including myself, to get a world-class education, reading, writing, arithmetic, STEM technology. Let's go explore the great, beautiful creation God's given us and give us the science tools to make the opportunities come true so that our dreams and our kids' dreams can come true. But instead, what do we have to deal with? A girl and a young lady in Montgomery County who did not want to shower with a person born as a male in her school because of the athletics, objected to showering with a person born as a male. And guess who got sent to the principal's office for counseling? It was the young lady. Now, this is wrong, and this is the program that needs to change. We've got to get back to a rational approach that honors young ladies in their showers, that makes sure that parents are involved. Look, we're a smart people. We're a loving people. We can make sure that children who struggle with these identity issues are cared for, but we don't need to indoctrinate the entire student population over this. So I think a more pragmatic approach is the way I would handle it.
So the Kerwin Commission was a commission that was formed a number of years ago to ensure that there was fair funding or enough funding in our state to ensure education initiatives across our state were carried out. What did you feel about the Kerwin Commission? Do you think that we have a money issue relative to education, or do we have a philosophical issue?
Primarily philosophical. For instance, we have one of the highest paid education systems, not only in America, but in the world. So some of the better education systems in the world right now have less funding than Maryland, than the state of Maryland provides in our schools. And so the problem tends to be a top-down model that is not very useful and helpful for teachers in the classroom. We have a very heavy administrative structure, and Kerwin, I have a couple problems with. Number one, it creates more bureaucratic top-down control with the super board. I also pointed out that one of the problems that I didn't like about Kerwin in the briefing, you can watch the video of this in my committee, is that many teachers will now have to go through additional certifications. Well, this will disproportionately impact minority jurisdictions, because in minority jurisdictions, they're relying heavily, sadly, in minority majority schools many times have to rely heavily on supplemental teaching and part-time teachers. And so if the model continues, the teachers that we do have are going to be disproportionately affected. I pointed this out in the briefing, that our teachers of color and those who just need to be able to get paid and make sure that they can have those resources are now going to be penalized if they don't go through advanced training by certain deadlines. Well, that's not going to incentivize. I think it's going to be a detriment. And then lastly, of course, with the super board, you have a bureaucratic nightmare that I think takes away too much authority from parents and local jurisdictions. And as I think one of the listeners just asked me, or did a post here in the chat room, what would I do about involving parents, and how would the structure look? Would I be appointing everyone, or would this be something that would go to the local school boards? And the answer to that is the governor appoints the State Board of Education, and the local school boards are generally either elected or appointed, and not by the governor, but by the local people in that jurisdiction, whether it's City of Baltimore, whether it's your counties. Now, unfortunately, Baltimore City does not have much of an elected representative board. It's appointed inclusively of the mayor and the governor's involved somewhat. But I think we need to get to more power back to the people model. Let's make sure that the opportunities that our kids have are not crushed by this new Kerwin model. So I will make sure that we work with this Kerwin model in a way that blesses our communities and isn't a top-down, heavy-handed approach, but instead to make it happen and to make sure that our bureaucracy works for the people, that the phones are answered, that it's not going to be an appointed board of staff members making decisions and withholding money. And that was the third part of this that I was trying to get to, and that is the withholding of funds. If the super board does not appreciate what a local school is doing, they can then withhold a large percentage of the funds to that particular school and bypass the local school board and that decision making. That's a concern. So I think we need to roll that out very cautiously. I would want to instead encourage that they work with the local school boards to make sure that any school that's being penalized, that is brought to the table quickly, and that we get to the bottom of the answers rather than just simply withholding the funds, because that's not going to help the teachers and the students. So that's kind of a quick approach that I would to give it a sketch.
Right. Yeah. And you've been very thorough in your answers. And, I encourage the viewers to put questions in the chat for Delegate Cox and the production team. We talked about it. Nothing inappropriate is going to come through this. We're having a very good dialogue, respectful comments only through. And I encourage the production team to screen that. No inappropriate comments whatsoever, because we've got to get beyond that as a people. So one more question from me, Delegate Cox, relative to education, because, before you know it, we're already at the halfway point, and we've got a bit more to cover, a bit more to hear from you, because we don't want people to have sound bites. We want people to be able to make an educated decision as to whether there is an opportunity for them to, take a look at you as an alternative. So when it comes to the history of African Americans or Black people in this country, we all know that Black people originate in this country out of slavery. And then you have the CRT, which you have spoken very staunchly against. And so my question to you is there a place in our school system to teach about the history of Black people in this country, to the significance that they believe it should be taught? And is the definition of critical race theory what you object to, but not necessarily indoctrinating the history of Black people in this country into our public school curriculum?
The answer is yes. And I would want to actually require the teaching of our history for our African American history, particularly when it comes to the amazing and beautiful stories of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and so many others that provided the foundations of our civil rights here in Maryland. Those have to be taught in school, and all the stories and the struggles that they went through. When you look at Frederick Douglass and his struggle on the Eastern Shore, and when you look at Harriet Tubman, working through the night, slipping up through creek beds, saving people's lives, and the struggles that she went through, and the physical harm that she endured for freedom. This has to be taught in our schools. It's a beautiful thing. It inspires all of us. That's why I was proud to see their statues, their bronze statues, installed in the old House chamber in our House of Delegates building, and was proud to be part of that dedication with Speaker Adrian Jones, who I voted for to be the first African American woman Speaker of the Maryland House. But what we can't do, and what is inappropriate, is to allow a Marxist view of our country to say that because we have had struggles in the past, that America and Maryland, in essence, is systemically evil, and therefore we need to eradicate institutions. We need to, as my opponent says, indict the whole system. And the problem with that approach is it's divisive. It looks at people not through the eyes of God and of love and of making sure that we right the wrongs, because we're a great nation. That's what our foundation is upon. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. But instead, it looks to eradicate those very rights, saying that the founders were therefore systemically or historically evil, rather than looking forward to say they had a dream, just like Martin Luther King Jr. They wanted to make sure that freedoms were there for everyone. Maybe they made mistakes, that we know they made mistakes along the way, but look what the result is. That dream is being preserved. It's being ever improved upon. And it's something that we can all take pride in as Marylanders, to join together. And so I would absolutely want to see, our schools embrace the teaching of history, African American history, should be a required subject. We should have tours of our children. And I by the way, had a privilege of teaching high school for 10 years. And I did tours like this. We would go to the Eastern Shore. We would go, and when I did my American government tour, I didn't want there to be this sense of not understanding the fact that our government was of the people, by the people, for the people. And so I would take them to the three branches, Article 1, 2, and 3. We would go tour Congress. We would tour the White House. We would tour the Supreme Court. And then we would go and see these historical markers and read the stories and understand how our civil rights were formed. That's something that we need to have in our schools, and I intend to ensure that is taught, preserved, supported, and is done in a way that is completely truthful and open to the nature of everything that has been done in our state. I mean, look, it's also, in the Jewish community, we've had a very sad history there as well. All of that needs to be taught. But in that context, we need to remember that we are not going to eradicate those very things that have made us great and that have helped us all to become more free.
That's a great, thorough answer. And what I'd like to do, you're watching 60 Minutes in Black America. We're interviewing today the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Delegate Dan Cox. Questions in the chat. If you're watching us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There was a question from someone that said they were running for an office, a Bazemore. Could we pull that question up? Because I want to get to our crime and justice question for Delegate Cox as well, but I don't want to ignore the viewers' comments and questions that they have for you as well, Delegate Cox. So it says, will you order forensic audits for transparency and accountability to the taxpayer dollars, making sure the dollars are spent in the classroom?
The answer is yes. I voted for an audit. Sadly, the audit was sent over to the DLS, Department of Legislative Services, and it in my view, could have some added benefits if we did a much more independent, maybe a out-of-state auditor or something. We have to make sure we have transparency, and I intend to make sure that our teachers get the funding they need. And when we see so much money, coming into the school systems, but the end result is it's not reaching the classrooms, pardon me, that's a concern.
Right. So, Delegate Cox, let's move on to a bit of social justice, crime and justice. I recall during the course of the primary campaign, we played a clip of your lieutenant governor candidate, Ms. Schifrinelli, in Baltimore City with the backdrop talking about crime in Baltimore City. So when it comes to recidivism and keeping and investing in pipeline, what are your plans to, first of all, bring down, particularly in these urban centers in the Baltimore, Prince George's, Baltimore County areas? What is your plan to bring down crime in those areas? And then what is your plan, on the other hand, for those that have been incarcerated coming out, so that you don't have the constant cyclical aspect of the prison pipeline?
So I have, pardon me.
If you were in the studio, I'd give you some water, man. I mean, we got to get back. That's one thing I agree. We got to get back so I can hand you a bottle of water. So
I'll be looking forward to that. Thank you so much. So I agree. We have a plan we put up that details a positive approach to dealing with the crime issue very quickly in Baltimore City, particularly, but also Prince George's County is asking for, assistance from the state. We have to make immediate action for preserving and protecting lives. I would very quickly work with the state's attorney of Baltimore City. I would work with the mayor. I would sit down at the table with them and say, what is the plan right now that you have to put in place? And if you don't have one, let's pull the experts in today. Let's figure this out. Let's have a plan approach that starts responding immediately to the shootings, immediately to the fentanyl issues, and the other violent crimes, so that people feel safe in their communities. Because right now in West Baltimore, if you call for help, it's going to be 45 minutes approximately from what they tell me. And I was just in West Baltimore 2 weeks ago with the E. coli thing. They do not show up. But that's not the same in other counties. Like in my county, if there's a problem, deputies are there within minutes. That's not right. We need to make sure that we have equalized access to safety across the state of Maryland, and I intend to make it happen immediately. This is not an against the police or a police against us issue. This is something that is focused on community policing, making our neighborhoods safer for our children, and making sure that the money that is allocated for policing makes them the most qualified and the most accessible in our state for our community. So I think we need to take immediate action. You know, it's an interesting scenario when you have the NAACP calling for the National Guard to help in this issue. That's quite a development. It shows a sense that people are seriously crying out for help. When I was there in West Baltimore, I saw the videos. I was with two different pastors, and there was a gentleman that showed me videos on his phone of people twitching and dying in the street that I was standing on the sidewalk right next. You know, this is wrong. This is not, you know, I think we're approaching 400 murders. This is wrong. We have to do better, and we can do better. We see models happening in other areas, such as, you know, in Detroit, we see that they're coming back from some serious issues through an aggressive approach. I intend to take immediate action on this issue, and if necessary, to then make sure that we have follow through with the constitutional process to ensure that our state's attorneys, our prosecutors, put these people that are dangerous behind bars. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't reform our correctional system. I was brokenhearted when I toured Jessup with my committee because it was 100 degrees, and it was horrific that there was no air, excuse me, in the prison, particularly the part that we toured, just had a fan, and there were inmates crying out that they couldn't breathe. It was so hot. And so I sent a letter to my chairman and to the state prison director, and I said, this is totally unconscionable. We have to take immediate action to make sure that our correctional facilities are going to be providing the necessary protection to the citizenry with the way we protect people by locking them up, but that we are going to treat them as Imago Dei. They are made in the image of God. They're not to be treated like this, to be almost roasted in their cells during hot heat waves. So I think we had some improvement there. I was told that numerous fans were immediately distributed. My chairman also joined in that effort. Now, what we need to do, though, is when people have served their time and they see that this is not something they want to do again, they want to get into a pattern of life that gives them success. We need to have an option for them to have those the businesses receive tax credits to allow them to be hired. We need to empower them back into their communities to have strong and stable communities. Right now, unfortunately, a lot of times they're released from prison and they're immediately put on government benefits without an option for jobs and training. So I think we need to make sure that we expand our opportunities for them to make their lives successful through jobs and small business training and through tech training. Because when you give people hope and an option, it gives them vision. Without vision, as we know, Solomon said, without vision, the people perish. So that's crucial. And I think that I will then expand the office that handles this. There's an office in the governor's office and also the state that works on ending this pipeline where we have a recidivism rate that's so high. I have supported other programs like this, like Teen Challenge for our young people, and also that program expanded to young adults. where their recidivism rate is 90%, their lack of recidivism rate is 90%. So that means because of their model of training for work, people are not reoffending as greatly. So I would like to expand those models.
Wow. And you're again watching 60 Minutes in Black America, and there's one thing about this: if Delegate Cox finds himself in position where he becomes the governor, to what he has said to us tonight is documentable. That's one of the reasons why we like this, as well as his first telecast. To what he says that he's able to do, willing to do, has done, particularly when it relates to prison reform. He just told us that he was in Jessup, he ordered fans because the conditions were so deplorable. And so, now we are documenting these conversations of our politicians as we continue to hold them accountable. Delegate Cox, I want to switch because I want to honor what I asked you to do for me this evening, which was about an hour, and we're about 14 minutes away. And, we want to understand what you see as your path towards victory for the State House. But first, interesting fact I uncovered the past few weeks. You're the son of a minister?
Yes, sir. I am very blessed. My dad is pastored now for about 45 years, maybe a little bit longer. I think he's coming up on his 50th anniversary soon, actually. I love my dad. He's 73. He loves the Lord. He works very hard, and he has invested his life not only in pastoring, but in building up the family. And this is where I believe, received a passion for encouraging families and making sure our public policy supports families and children. And that's because my father's work has been to point out that when you don't have strong families, you don't have strong communities, you don't have strong churches, and the end result is you don't have a strong state, and you have the community breaking down. And the way back is to make sure that we don't put obstacles in the way or temptations in the path of those who want to marry, of those who want to make sure they raise their children together, and of having the access to jobs and business opportunities that is needed for our families. That's why I was so opposed to the lockdowns of our businesses. I had someone in the government tell me that I would be okay if I just simply challenged the lockdowns on the grounds of churches, which I did. But I said, no, I've got to include business. Why? Because business is the lifeblood of the family structure, which means if you're taking away access, to our children's future through shutting down their family small business or whatever jobs they have, you're shutting down and closing out the schools. You're closing out opportunities for those kids to have extracurricular benefits, and that's going to be harmful. Also, it's upending the structure and the strength of our families. That's where small business comes into play. It really is a blessing in our state that we have 50% of our economy of small businesses, and that needs to be encouraged and not in any way prevented from occurring. And that's a passion that my dad provided as a pastor. My mom and my dad are just real wonderful people, saints. They've served our state and expanded alternative education options for the whole state as part of that work.
Well, I'm glad you got an opportunity to get that in for mom and dad, and we're down to the last 11, 12, 13 minutes possibly. And, this is probably the more difficult as we talk about your path towards victory, but also talk about what people have described as a discomfort with you from a standpoint of being endorsed by Donald Trump. I know that back in 2021, you did go back to the state legislative ethics committee here in the state of Maryland. And you said that you regretted tweeting that then Vice President Pence was a traitor. Can you talk about what the impetus was for you to take buses to the Capitol, and if you had a chance to do those things over again that surrounded that day that Americans feel that day is not a part of history that many Americans aren't proud of, would you make some changes to the decisions you made surrounding that day?
Well, I would start out by just making it clear for everyone that I've been wrongly smeared. I've never bussed anybody to the Capitol, and I was not present nor supportive of the violence there at the Capitol. I think it was despicable, it was wrong. And what I can say that, I took my children, I think it was 7 kids. I wanted to have a civics opportunity to hear the President of the United States. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to go to our Capitol and to see the White House and to hear the President speak. And there were a lot of people there, and I was privileged, and I did not bus anybody there. I think the individuals that were arranging those buses used my name, saying that I was coming with the children. I was going to be there to kind of to hype up, hey, Delegate Cox is going to go. But no, I bought tickets for my kids. I did not bus anyone. But I can say this, looking forward, I am just wanting so much to see more unity in our country and to see this division that we see President Biden do, where he put the red lights behind him and called 80 million people, 75 million Americans, called them basically evil. He just did this in Philadelphia at the cradle of our republic, right there in Freedom Hall. And I just, it boggles my mind that the President of the United States would do that. And then he comes to Maryland to campaign for my opponent, and he calls me all sorts of names. The President did. I just think that's not the path forward, because people are hurting. Leon, I was just told that one of my constituents emailed and said their rent has gone up over $2,000 a month with a small 2-bedroom efficiency suite, because property taxes have skyrocketed with this taxation inflation. And this is what my opponent is all in for. And so the path to victory, as you had asked, is the path of the people. If the people like what they are receiving now with the Biden approach, the Moore approach, he stands with Biden. He stands with this process of the gender identification indoctrination for children. It's on his website. He tried to, one of the newspapers tried to downplay that, but anybody can go to his website and see that's what he's going to do. And it's not only that, he said he's going to do it across all the local boards. So when you look at our policies is to put power back into the family, back into the community, back into the people's money, back in your pockets, lowering inflation, lowering taxation. Look, if Delaware can do it, it's a blue state in Delaware, 5.5% taxation rate there for the corporate tax rate. We're 8.25%. No wonder our jobs are having such high increase in taxation. So
are you seriously considering, if you become governor, having a flat tax? I think you said a flat tax of 10% on everyone that makes over $39,000 or $38,000 a year. Is that doable? Have you all done the math on that, or eliminating state tax altogether? I think that's something your platform is. Is that true that you had put that out there?
I have not put out a flat tax, no, but I have said that I would like to work towards a package eliminating the income tax for our workers. And when I was asked, isn't that extreme? My answer to that was, is Florida extreme? People love it down there, and they have a $22 billion surplus, and they don't have an income tax for their workers. And their corporate tax rate is much more competitive than Maryland's. So, and the path forward, a lot of times people say, oh, well, they have an entertainment industry. Well, maybe that's why we don't have an entertainment industry, number one. But Florida's just one of 9 states that does this. All of those states are doing better financially than Maryland, for our workers, that is. And so I think it's a winnable bipartisan approach. I know one of the Democrat governor candidates actually proposed a very similar model. I was surprised to see that. But it's something that I've always believed in, because it puts money back into the workers' pockets. When you get your paycheck, one of the things that shocks so many young people, they get that first paycheck and they're thinking, well, what's this 33% going to? What is this FICA about? What is all this? We need to make sure that we put money back into the pockets of those who are the hard-earning workers. They're the ones that are being fleeced at the pump right now with this inflationary gas tax, with this whole inflationary property tax that's being passed on to our renters. It's hurting our affordable housing. This is real. This is serious. We can do better. And I'm the guy who's out there fighting for it to
Well,
lower
I promised you in your campaign that you deserve and you would get, just as Wes Moore, when Mr. Moore comes on here as well, a time at the end, 5 minutes, 7 minutes to speak to our viewers, to speak to the world about what it is and why they should vote for you. So I only have a couple more questions for you that I'd like to have you answer. First, would you support the red line? Governor Hogan didn't support the red line when he came into office. Would you support the red line, yes or no, in Baltimore?
Very seriously considering yes. I want to make it happen, though, and not create a boondoggle of funding problems. And I think the issue...
That's the same word he used.
Oh, did he? I don't want to do that. I don't want to use that word. No, I'm all for trains and metro. I'm very supportive. But what I want to do first is I want to audit the Transportation Trust Fund and publish it online. And that will then expose where the money's been going, why has it supposedly not been available to finish the red line. To make that happen, we've got to
You mean the purple line or the red line? The purple line? Are you talking about the purple line, finishing that?
Well, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The purple line has been struggling to make budget.
Right.
And then the red line obviously was nixed. So these are things that should be looked at immediately. Why? Because these are our flagship city of Baltimore needs to have transportation be, world class. You go to any other country or even other states and you have world class transportation, and they're not, a net negative to the state. They're not a taxpayer burden. We can do that here.
And so, final question for you before I give you time to speak to our viewers about why they should support you. So a recent poll came out, the Goucher poll came out and said that you were 22 points behind. And so it has been said in circles that the race would be a lot closer if there wasn't such an association with you saying that the elections were stolen from Joe Biden, and that perhaps that some of what it is that you believe in terms of, now you've told us today that you didn't send buses up to the Capitol. You've said that, so that's documented. You said that. I know that I read in several places that they even said 6 buses, but you refuted that. So when it comes to the election and being a election denier, right? Is that a consideration when you look at it, when you look at a Mitch McConnell and some of the other national Republican leadership that acknowledged that the election was won by Biden? And maybe you don't answer that, but I hear that you would gain as much as 15% of that 22% because people would look at you a bit differently if you weren't an election denier. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not an election denier. I believe firmly in our democratic process, and I fought for it. I want every vote.
Maybe I misspoke. Maybe I should have said that you don't believe that the election that Joe Biden won, and you deny the fact that Joe Biden won that election fairly. Is that more accurate?
I think that there was serious fraud, and that, yes, this is a problem that is bipartisan. And when people want to make it partisan, I just turn it right around and say, well, do you believe Jamie Raskin was wrong when he said that Hillary Clinton had the election stolen? Nobody calls him on the carpet for that. And number 2, look what happened in Frederick just last month. We had a young lady, African-American, I believe she won by 1 vote, and she beat the council president. And they took that away from her after certification of the election, alleging fraud. And so then they decertified the election, took her vote away, alleging that she had voted out of the city. She hadn't moved in time or something. I don't know the whole story. But in any case, they then put in the Democrat county council president back into that spot after this young lady worked so hard to win, alleging fraud. And so I say, look, this is what I'm talking about. It's an issue of security to make sure that all parties have one vote, all people have one vote, and that all parties have a voice. And I think that we can all agree on that and look forward to say that we've got to make sure that the system works for the people and that it's not something that we take lightly. You know, this is a very serious part of our democracy. Our republic rests upon free, open, and fair elections. And I stand with the history of fighting all types of discrimination against election. I want access for everyone. When you look back, you know, look in certain areas of our history, this was one of the biggest areas of civil rights that I stand with in support of. We have got to have access to good elections, and that's all that I'm talking about. That's all I've ever said.
And I understood, very much understood. Did Donald Trump lose the election?
You're asking me about the 2020 election?
Did Donald Trump lose?
No, he did not, and I'll tell you why. There's a Supreme Court ruling in Pennsylvania that just found that the entire election scheme was unconstitutional, and that therefore, if that were to be played out, the Pennsylvania electors would be, by constitutional law, required to be decertified. Now, I don't know the end result of that. I'm not involved in that. I just point that out as an example that we can't say, as a matter of fact, in a court of law, if you were to swear under oath, you would not be able to swear under oath today that Biden won. Otherwise, you'd have to acknowledge that, or you'd have to reject the fact that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania is on record saying that that was an illegal scheme for the entire mail-in ballot. The entire mail-in ballot.
Let me ask you another question before I give you your time. Is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, wrong to send and fly immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, or to go from Texas to Martha's Vineyard, and Governor DeSantis using taxpayer dollars from Florida to do that, to transport those immigrants up there? Was that wrong?
Well, I don't know what you mean by wrong. Legal, I'm not sure if it's legal or not. I do say this: we have a cartel.
Well, let's say if it's illegal, it's wrong.
Well, certainly if it's illegal, it's wrong. I can tell you this, that when you look at the Texas border right now, I think we can all agree, as both parties, that we need to make sure we secure that border. I think Biden's doing an about face on this now, I've heard, because when you look at Baltimore City, what do you see every day? People dying in the streets from fentanyl. It's a disgrace. And so we need to be saving lives, ending this flow of fentanyl over the border, which has gone up. I think the last number I saw was something like 400% since President Biden took over. So we have a complete open border. It hurts our jobs for our minority majority districts. And by the way, I'm pro-immigrant, very pro-immigrant. My brother-in-law is from Mexico City, and both of my grandparents, or great-grandparents, and my wife's great-grandparents were immigrants. So,
as well as your lieutenant governor, right?
My lieutenant governor, that was one of the big, wonderful things about her story, is just, this is the American spirit. This is the American story. So, but, we all know that if we don't have laws, then we don't have civil rights. And I'm all about civil rights.
Well, Delegate Cox, I really appreciate you being here. And to the word that I said, that you would have the last word. I could go on and on with you in terms of this conversation. And as you see, the viewership is extremely high. They're not going anywhere. They want to hear more. But in fairness to what it is we said and commit to, Delegate Cox, it's your stage to talk to the viewers about why they should support you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I would humbly ask you to consider your own children, to consider your own family, consider your own future, to say, do you want a future that has the state able to take your children out of your care and custody if you disagree with gender indoctrination in schools? And this is happening in California, and it's coming here to Maryland. And I'm not making this up. There's a Latino lady that tells the story here in Maryland, warning us to say her daughter, 12-year-old daughter, was taken away from her by the state because she disagreed with the gender indoctrination and the gender surgery to take away her female abilities as a 12-year-old. This is unconscionable. And they removed her from her home because she objected. This is the agenda that I'm fighting. And the end result is this young lady was so distraught that she threw herself in front of a train and died. And the mother now is pleading with everyone, wake up before it's too late. We have to get our state back on track with a world-class education. That's what I intend to do. I'm humbly asking for your vote. I also am focusing on our businesses and our jobs to make sure that those are growing and the taxation is reduced. My opponent, God bless him, he's all in for more taxation. He's all in to make sure that gender indoctrination continues with a centralized education focus. If you like the policies that you see in Baltimore City with the murder rate, that's what you're going to get with my opponent's administration. But with my administration, I ask for you to give me a chance to work for the people, to bring power back to the people, to make sure our streets and communities have the resources they need and the safety that our kids deserve and the education that they're guaranteed under our Constitution. So with that, I humbly ask for your support and vote, and thank you so much for this opportunity today. God bless you all.
Delegate Cox, thank you so much for being with us today in 60 Minutes in Black America. Good luck in the future. Good luck to your family. Good luck to your parents. And God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
My name is Mike Haney, and you've watched another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America. Today we had Republican gubernatorial candidate for the state of Maryland, Delegate Dan Cox. As I mentioned earlier, we are working with the West Moore camp to get Mr. Moore in the next few days. He will come back. He will be in as he was in the primary to talk to you about his platform. And as we talked about at the top of the hour, it's very important that we as a people understand both perspectives, is that we understand hearing exactly as you heard Mr. Cox tonight explain and speak to what the issues and the concerns were out there of him as a Trump supporter and endorsed by Donald Trump. Now it's up to you to vote, first of all, and to make a decision as to whose platform is best once you hear Mr. Moore's platform and what he has to say to you as a voter. You've heard Mr. Cox. I look forward to seeing each of you next week. Have a great week, and thank you again for tuning in to another edition of 60 Minutes in Black America.